Reflections of a Russian Statesman by Konstantin Petrovich Pobyedonostseff. Chapter 8. The Malady of Our Time. In our time, discontent is universal. With many, this discontent has developed into chronic irritability. By what is it caused? By their lots, their rulers, social order, other men, and by all and everything except themselves. Men grow discontented when their expectations are deceived. This is the discontent of disenchantment, born for a day, atoned for often by the next. It is a passing malady, not to be confused with the present complaint, a permanent and epidemic disease which has tainted all the younger generation. We grow up with infinite expectations, begotten of immeasurable vanity and innumerable artificial needs. In ancient times, the number of restful and contented persons was greater, for men expected less of life, were satisfied with less, and did not hasten to extend their sphere of life. Each was held by his place, and to his work by the sentiment of duty associated with them. The humble watched the lives of the rich and idle, and thinking, "This is not for us," resigned themselves to the impossible. Now this impossibility has become possible and attainable in the imaginations of all. The private soldier aspires to the dignity of a general, and seeks to attain it, not with hard service, with duty performed or distinction gained, but by accident and sudden acquisition. Success is now believed to be the result of accident or good fortune, and by this belief all are incited, as the gambler by the hope of gain. In business transactions, the credit system rules. Credit has become the most powerful instrument for the creation of new values, and this instrument is accessible to all, and, owing to the comparative facility with which it is employed, by no means all the values created are real or subserve the purposes of production, while many are fictitious and ephemeral, for the satisfaction of adventitious and temporary interests created for the purpose of sudden enrichment. As a consequence, the success of an enterprise is no longer proportionate to the personal activity, the energy, aptitude, and knowledge of its promoter. In the economic sphere, towards every undertaking are drawn a multitude of unseen currents and intangible eventualities, which cannot be foreseen or provided for. The worker has no longer to strive merely with definite obstacles, but also with a complex network of difficulties which surrounds him on every side. Calculations fail because circumstances essential to their accuracy have escaped consideration. Hence the condition of uncertainty, alarm, and weariness from which so many suffer. All activity is paralyzed by mental conditions in which the worker feels that he lacks the strength to conquer circumstances, that his will and intellect are feeble before the obstacles which confront him. His energies are weakened. The man of action becomes a fatalist, and relies for success no longer upon foresight and sagacity, but upon blind accident and good fortune. This is the prime cause of the pessimism which infects so many of our generation, and to some extent also the cause of another prevalent ailment, practical materialism, the craving for sensual pleasures. The sensual instincts awaken with particular strength in a life spent in anxious and feverish activity, and founded upon infidelity and accident. The same phenomena appear in other spheres of social work. Everywhere credit is the strongest instrument. Everywhere we see created with astonishing ease swirling in fictitious values, which, under favoring circumstances, bring fortunes to some, while in the hands of others, at the first contact with the actualities of life, they crumble into dust. Reputations are gained with amazing speed. The required training once obtained or evaded, appointment to responsible positions may be attained with commensurate emolument and authority. The illiterate journalist becomes the celebrated litterateur and publicist. The mediocre lawyer wins the glory of a great orator. The charlatan of science appears a learned professor. The ignorant, inexperienced youth becomes a procurator, a judge, an administrator, the draftsman of important laws, and the young slip, yesterday breaking through the earth, stands today in the place of a great tree. All these values are swollen and fictitious, but they multiply daily in the market of life, and their possessors traffic with them as brokers traffic with worthless shares. Many maintain their false values throughout life, remaining, nevertheless, shallow, feeble, frivolous, and unproductive. But the honor of most are quickly dissipated in dust, and the worthlessness of their owners exposed. Meantime, their vanity has swollen to unnatural limits. Their pretensions and needs have grown beyond measure. Their desires have been inflamed, and in the moment of trial when action is needed, their resources fail them, in strength, in reason, in character, in knowledge. Thence comes the number of moral bankruptcies, which spring from causes identical to the causes of bankruptcies in the economic world. It is hard to estimate the amount of energy wasted in our time through its irregular, abortive, and thoughtless application, and through the irregular circulation of capital of all kinds in our markets. As a result, we see around us young people broken, ruined, and mutilated for life. Some cannot bear their own burdens, and, as overheated vessels, burst asunder. In exasperation, they end by suicide, lives which thenceforth are worthless to those who have been accustomed to consider themselves the center of life, and to measure all things by a purely material standard, which the moment it slips from their hands sends all their calculations astray. Others shuffle through the world, multiplying the number of the discontented and the irritated against life and society. It will be a sad day when their number shall so increase as to give occasion to satisfying their vengeance and desire. The ancients, we are told, were accustomed to place a skeleton or a skull in the midst of their banquet halls, that they might be reminded of the proximity of death. This custom has decayed. We feast and make merry, and strive to banish all thoughts of death. Nevertheless, at the back of each stands death, and this threatening face at any moment may appear before us. Every morning brings news of suicides, those suicides unexplained and inexplicable, which threaten to become a familiar feature of our lives. It is terrible to think that some day we may become accustomed to this feature. Never has there been a time when the human soul was valued at so low a price, when there reigned such indifference to the fate of men created in the image of God and redeemed by the blood of Christ. Rich and poor, learned and ignorant, age and youth, which has hardly begun life, nay, the verily tottering infant, throw away their lives with inconceivable recklessness, some without a word, others, in their last moments, extolling to the world themselves and their deed. What is the cause? That life has become deformed, false, and meaningless beyond belief. That order has disappeared, that all rational sequence in human development has vanished, that all discipline of thought, of sentiment, and of morals has disappeared. Corruption and disintegration have destroyed the simple, organic relations of public and family life. Their place has been usurped by institutions and abstract principles, for the most part false in themselves, or in false relations to life and actuality. The simple needs of the soul and body have been expelled by a multitude of artificial requirements, and the simplest sentiments have given way to sentiments complex and artificial, which seduce and irritate the soul. Vanity, which once grew commensurately with our environment and conditions, has suddenly been magnified to the immensity of the human ego, which violates all discipline and usurps an absolute dominion over life, liberty, and happiness, claiming to rule alike over circumstance and fate. The minds of men, strong and weak, high and low, great and small, all alike have lost the faculty of recognizing their own ignorance, and the capacity to learn, that is, to submit to the law of life, while men exalt themselves to that visionary height from which each, great or small, holds himself as judge of life and of the universe. Thus has accumulated an infinite mass of falsehoods, pervading all relations, poisoning the atmosphere which we breathe, the medium in which we live and move, the thought that controls the will, the word with which the thought is expressed. Among such falsehoods, what can we seek but a feeble growth, a feeble existence, and feeble deeds? The very conception of life and of its aims becomes falsified. Our relations are disordered, and life has lost the harmony essential to tranquil development and normal activity. Is it strange, then, that so many cannot bear the burden and lose the balance of moral and intellectual forces essential for life? A crystal vessel heated equably will bear a high temperature, while heated suddenly or inequably it bursts asunder. Is it not thus with those unhappy suicides of whom daily we hear? Some perish from the inherent falsehood of their conceptions of life, which reality shatters in the dust. The miserable man who knows no support in life other than himself, who seeks outside himself no moral principle to sustain him in the struggle, flees from the field and seeks oblivion in effacement. Others perish from inability to reconcile their exalted ideals of life and action with the falsehoods around them, the falseness of men and the falseness of institutions. These lose faith in their ideas, and having no true faith to console them, they lose their balance, and, as cowards, cast away their lives. Many are ruined by sudden and unmerited success, victims of the power which they coveted so madly, but the burden of which they are unable to bear. For ours is a time of fictitious artificial greatness and celebrity for the mutual deception of men, and real merit finds it hard to arise and justify itself from obscurity, because in the market of human vanity only glittering money is gold. Men recklessly undertake responsibilities, imagining themselves capable of all things, and with little ability, without great effort, attain the highest positions. The prospect of power is seductive to human vanity. It brings a vision of honors and privileges, of power to bestow favors and to create other powers. Yet, whatever be the vulgar conception, the moral principle of power is simple and immutable. Whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. Were this not forgotten, who would seek to bear the unbearable burden? Nevertheless, all men are eager to accept power, and the burden has crushed and ruined many. For in our time the exercise of power is more arduous and complicated than ever. Great is the number of those for whom power, recklessly conferred and recklessly accepted, becomes a sphinx, and asks its fatal riddle. He who cannot solve it must perish. If we would reason aright, we must regard the object of our reasoning from the proper point of view. All depends upon this, and all human error proceeds from failure to observe this rule. We are accustomed to trust our impressions, but impressions are received merely from the surfaces of the objects along which we glide with such remarkable speed and agility. Delighted with our first impression, with human impatience and vanity, we hasten to impart it to others. By transmission of our impressions to receptive natures, error is formed, develops, and matures, percolates to the masses, and too often is accepted as the opinion of the public. This holds true in great matters as well as in small. Whole systems of astronomy obtained acceptance through the course of centuries, were considered indisputable, yet in the end were proven to be false, being formed from a wrong point of view. Such was the Ptolemaic system. For centuries, astronomers persisted in looking at the universe from the earth as the center point of view. The earth seemed so infinitely vast that no other center could be conceived. The system was full of contradictions and inconsistencies, for the removal of which men of science had recourse to an artificial system of cycles and ellipses. Centuries passed before Copernicus appeared and drew the false center out of the system. All was plain when once it was shown that the universe did not revolve around the earth, that the earth held no ruling position among the heavenly bodies at all, but was merely one of many planets, controlled by forces in power and importance immensely exceeding its own. The system of Ptolemy has long outlived its day, yet in our time its errors obtain in a new sphere of ideas and conceptions. For does not modern philosophy, which deals with men as the center of the universe, assuming that all existence revolves around him as science once made the sun revolve around the earth, fall into a similar pit? It is plain indeed that there is nothing new under the sun. This outworn creed is offered us as a novelty, as the last word of science. Then follow, one after another, contradictions, rejection of accepted propositions, new these categorically expressed, their categorical refutation, then wondrous discoveries no sooner made than forgotten. All this is termed progress, and the outward march of science. But in truth, are these not cycles and ellipses of the Ptolemaic system? When will the new Copernicus appear to break the spell, and prove that the center is not in man, but outside him, and infinitely higher than he, than the earth, than the universe itself? The same phenomena appear in the history of all sects, from the Gnostics and the Arians to the nihilists of today, the disciples of Pashkov, of Suteyev, of Tolstoy. Man, pursuing impressions, regards all things from the false point of view which he finds in himself, vainly imagining that the universe revolves around him. He looks for truth in all things and everywhere, and is wrathful with all whom he convicts, save himself, of passion and sin. It is a fatal error. Obstinacy and dogmatism in belief will always, it seems, be the attributes to our poor and narrow humanity, while men of deep and liberal thought must always be few. Faith gives place to faith, dogma hastens after dogma, and objects of fanaticism change forever. In our day, enlightened intelligence is ruled by generalization, and seeks for a logical constitution of life and society on abstract principles. These are the new fetishes that have taken the place of the old idols, for we, as our forefathers, set upon graven images and bow down before them. Our modern idols are phrases and generalities, such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, with all their variations and extensions, and are not as idols also the abstract propositions propounded by scholars and raised to the rank of dogmas as, for instance, the origin of species and the struggle for existence. Faith in abstract principles is the prevailing error of our time. This error consists in the dogmatic and absolute faith by which we disregard the facts of life with all its conditions and needs, ignoring distinctions of time and place, and the characteristics of individuals and the peculiarities of history. Life is not a science or a philosophy, but a living organism. Neither science nor philosophy, as external forces, can rule over our lives, but both have their origin in life, for they are built upon the observation, analysis, and classification of its phenomena. But it would be vain to think that they can exhaust and comprehend life in all its infinite manifestations, endow it with new elements, or reconstruct it upon new foundations. In their application to life, the propositions of science and philosophy have the value of hypothesis, and in all cases must be tested by common sense, by clear reasoning, and by the facts and phenomena to which they are applied. Other application would lead to violence and falsehood. The fact that there exist no few indisputable propositions in science and philosophy ought to be a warning to us. Most of the theses of science are the subjects of contention between schools and parties. Many are shaken by fresh experiment and research. Not a single practical science may be likened to a seamless garment. All are stitched from rags, more or less skillfully, the shape following the fashion, often with fragments hanging down in tatters, torn by the polemics of the different schools. Nevertheless, the representatives of the schools maintain their propositions absolutely, and demand their unconditional application to life. As an example, political economy is enough. Political economists have earned the reputation of dogmatic and intolerable pedants for wishing to apply to legislation and industry their abstract laws of production and of division of labor and capital, while they forget more or less the living forces and phenomena which in practice convert these laws and destroy their operation. Their formulas have been deduced from a multitude of facts and phenomena, the infinite variety of which they cannot exhaust in all the combinations which present themselves. These formulas have been of great advantage to science, which, thanks to them, has gained simplicity and advancement. Yet not one of them is the unalterable absolute law of life, which serves only to show the path to those who follow. Each expresses only a certain movement, a certain direction of forces, which in a given case must balance or contend with other forces acting in opposite directions. To calculate mathematically the action of these forces is impossible. Only the just instincts of common sense may estimate it. Thus the general conclusions of political economists, although deduced from indisputable premises, have only a contingent hypothetical value, and not the value of absolute and unalterable laws. As such are they regarded by every true scholar, uninfected by the pedantry of the schools. But this cannot be said of all scholars. What, then, shall we say about the mass of superficial readers, whose knowledge, as a rule, is derived from a few pages of a textbook, or from contemporary newspapers, or who expect, at a moment's notice, without any research, to find an answer to all questions by turning to the pages indicated in the contents table? For them, every generality serves as a supreme authority of science, as an easy means to the decision of the gravest questions, and as a convenient arm with which to resist the impulses of common sense, and to overthrow all the teachings of history and experience. Thanks to these abstract propositions and principles, it is easy for the emptiest and most superficial men, the idlest intriguers, to pass as profound philosophers, statesmen, and administrators, and to gain a cheap victory over common sense and experience. Such scholars, in the vulgar phrase, leap at once to the height of contemporary science and thought. Once on this height, who shall have strength to withstand them? The minds of the people are quite incapable of understanding general propositions in their true conditional significance. All formulas, all phenomena, are embodied by them in living, concrete images and forms. There is no more deplorable error than that through which we, inspired by a baseless faith in abstract propositions, would inspire the people with it also. This new play with the abstract conceptions circulated by the idealist educators of the masses is only too dangerous, for it involves the demoralization of the public conscience. Too often, unhappily, it is indulged in by our schools, but most of all, it has been practiced by democratic governments, and many governments have paid dearly for it by the sacrifice of sincerity in their moral relations to the people. Once false conceptions, false expectations, and false beliefs have taken root in the minds of the people, it is difficult for a government, itself corrupted by falsehoods, to extirpate them. It becomes necessary for the government to accept such falsehoods, to play with them anew, and to maintain its power artificially by a fresh network of subterfuges in its institutions, its language, and its actions, a network inevitably woven from its earliest compromise with untruth. The example of France is a clear demonstration of this. In the last century, the fantasy of idealist philosophers fashioned a new evangel for humanity, an evangel constructed wholly upon ideals and abstractions. The disciples of Rousseau had painted in a rosy color the natural man, predicting through return to nature universal content and felicity upon earth. They had revealed to all the newly solved mysteries of social and political life, and fabricated a fictitious social contract between the people and its ruler. The celebrated program of popular happiness was revealed as a secret of peace and concord and content for peoples and governments. The revelation was constructed upon monstrous generalities, in no way related to actual life, on the wildest, most extravagant fantasies. Yet this falsehood, which, it would seem, must have vanished at the faintest touch of actuality, infected the minds of men with a passionate desire to realize it in practice, and to construct upon its basis a new society and a new government. But one step more, the theories of Rousseau gave birth to the celebrated formula: liberty, equality, fraternity. These ideas, in indissoluble union with the ideas of duty and sacrifice, on which is set, as the living head upon the body, the whole organism of the moral universe, contain in themselves the eternal truth of the ideal moral law. But when it was sought to turn this formula into a law binding upon society, when it was sought to embody it in a formal law defining the relations of the people to its rulers, when it was to become the basis of a new religion for the nations, its fatal falseness was betrayed, and the perfect seed of love and peace and tolerance sown in the soil of formal legislation sprang up as violence and discord and fanaticism. For these maxims were proclaimed, not as the evangelic commandment of love, not as a summons to duty in the name of an ethical ideal, but as a covenant between the people and its rulers, as the annunciation of a new era of natural happiness, a promise of perpetual felicity. In no other way could the people accept or understand. The masses are not philosophers. Liberty, equality, and fraternity they accept as their right, as privileges they have won. How then can they be reconciled to all the evils that afflict mankind, the poverty, the lowliness, the deprivation, the self-denial, the subjection? Tolerate these they cannot. They murmur, they are exasperated, they protest, they rise and overthrow institutions and governments, which have not kept their word and have disappointed expectations. Misled by fanatic delusions, they build up new institutions again to destroy them. They rush into the arms of new rulers, whose flattering words have seduced them, to overthrow them in turn upon fresh disillusion. To rule the people by the direct exercise of authority becomes impossible without the aid of flattering words and false institutions, and governments are driven to dishonesty that they may evade destruction. Terrible indeed is this chaos in our institutions. Tumultuously the waves of passion roll on every side, tranquilized only for a moment by the magic sounds of liberty, equality, publicity, the sovereignty of the people. And he who best can play with these words becomes the master of the people. In ancient Rome an abyss appeared which threatened to engulf the whole city. All efforts to remedy the disaster were vain. The people appealed to the oracle, which answered that the abyss would be closed when Rome gave up in sacrifice its greatest treasure. We know the sequel. Curtius, the first citizen of Rome, the bravest of the brave, flung himself into the gulf, which closed forever. Among us, also, in the modern world, a terrible chasm has appeared, the chasm of pauperism, which separates the poor from the rich by an impassable gulf. What have we not sacrificed to fill it up? Mountains of gold and wealth of every kind, masses of sermons and instructive works, floods of enthusiasm, 100 social institutions organized expressly, all are swallowed up, yet the gulf yawns open as before. We, too, have invoked the oracle to reveal to us a certain remedy. The word of this oracle has long been spoken, and is well known to all. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. Could we find the true meaning of this precept? Could we rise to its height? Could we cast into the gulf all that is most precious to us, the theories, the prejudices, the practices which are bound with our respective callings, and confirmed in the hearts of each, we should sacrifice ourselves into the abyss and close it forever. The justest sentiments of the human soul remain true only while they preserve their independence and simplicity, for there is nothing simple which is not also right. The danger for every simple sentiment is its image in the consciousness, its reflex action. The sentiment acquires a new force when confirmed by reason and sanctioned by ideas, but at the same time it meets with the new danger of absorption by the reflective faculty and of consequent loss of simplicity. It may happen that sentiment, leaning upon thought for support, partakes of its nature and reissues a conscious formula from which the element of sentiment has disappeared. The form, as the latter, may kill the living spirit. The form deceives, for beneath it insensibly develop hypocrisy and the seductions of human vanity. Is there one thing more splendid, more precious, more fruitful than the sentiment of love in the human soul? Yet, from the moment it unites with reason, a danger threatens it from this reflex action. It may create itself a form, divide itself into classes, doctrines, categories, orders, and schools. At last, the time must come when it is no longer a simple sentiment, filling and enlivening the soul, but our poor human vanity imagines that it masters the sentiment and makes it its bondsman and instrument. Here simplicity disappears, decomposition begins, and, with little more, hypocrisy may end. The works of love, it may be, will multiply, order will replace impulse, but simplicity of feeling has flown, the perfume has departed. These thoughts are inspired by consideration of our organized philanthropic institutions and benevolent societies, with their regulations, their committees, their honorary members, and their honorary rewards. In principle, all institutions are devoted to charity and beneficence, but in view of their proceedings, we are forced to ask, where is there room here for active, sympathetic love? We watch the meetings of boards, where speeches are delivered, and the committees where men and women sit wearied and indifferent, ignorant of affairs, discuss regulations in paragraphs. We read reports prepared by paid officials. We hear the magniloquent verdicts of self-appointed pedagogues on systems of instruction. We attend, O height of hypocrisy, the charity bazaar, where the lady stall-keepers, who have sacrificed not a penny, are dressed in costumes costing double the profit of their sales. And these we call the works of Christian charity. Such is love as a social institution. There is still justice, on which the world is based. Justice without which life would become the nightmare of wild imagination. How stands justice in its modern artificial European dress of a judicial institution? We find a machine for the artificial execution of justice, but justice itself is dumb in the triumphant turmoil of mechanical production. Its voice is stifled in the tumult of the wheels of the great machine. We seek here a moral force. Alas, the only force is consumed in the turning of the wheels which keep the machine in incessant motion. The only moral strength of the workers is spent in the greasing of these wheels and their connections. There sit the judges in proud consciousness of their priestly dignity, and, like the ancient augurs, listen with more or less attention while lawyers bring forth magniloquent and sonorous phrases from the narrow byways of the pettifogging mind, carefully estimating first the money value of their long periods. Thus pass away the wearying hours of trials, while the chief victim of the sacrifice of unhappy justice must reach the promised land by the thin hair of the Mahomet's bridge, and woe unto him who relies for safety upon his own strength. He only finds justice who, having studied the arts of the acrobat, on his pathway neither stumbles nor trips. All human life is a search for happiness. The unquenchable thirst for happiness burns in man from the awakening of consciousness, and is sated never at his latest breath. The hope of happiness has no limits. It is infinite as the universe. It knows no ultimate aim, for its beginning and its end are in eternity. The Mongol fabulist symbolizes this incessant chase of joy in the story of a mother who has lost her dearly loved daughter, her only child. The rude imaginations of the dwellers of the steppes conceive this mother as an old woman with one eye on the top of her head. With bitter sobs she wanders through the world, seeking her lost child, and stopping time after time at some object with which she thinks she sees its face. She takes it up, bears it away, and lifts it high above her head to satisfy herself that she has really found her treasure. Scarcely has she looked at it when she sees that she has been mistaken, and in despair throws it to the earth, dashing it to pieces, and starts again on her unfruitful quest. The happiness sought by man determines his fate, and brings forth too often unhappiness as its fruit. The wretchedness of man, says Carlyle, comes from his greatness. He is wretched because of the infinite within him, and with his art he cannot imprison this infinite within the limits of the finite. Therefore is unhappiness, being infinite, unattainable. Why, then, does man, conscious of this, so gaily hasten to his fruitless journey? Why, abandoning the present, and turning aside in despair from the future, does he look to the past and find the possibility there? There are few men who have not in their path some time of which they may say, happiness was possible then, so near. But happiness forsook man at that moment when first he sought to master the infinite, to make it his own domain, to know it. And ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. This knowledge he has not attained, only a dual nature has been given to him. From that day one half of his spiritual being has sought the other, to establish an unity and integrity in life. If there is one thing on this earth which may rightly be called happiness, it is a state of the few in that period of simple existence and simple consciousness when the soul feels life in itself, and finds in that feeling rest, seeking not to know at all, but imagining in itself eternity, as a drop of pure water on a twig reflects the splendor of the sun. Where such a state exists, Heaven grant that it may endure, that its subject by his will may strive not to escape from the limits of his destiny. The door of such happiness opens not towards the inside. Push it from the inside, it will shut no more. It opens from the inside, and he who wishes that it remain closed must not even touch it. We condemn our past because we seek there vainly those principles which constitute for us the standard of truth and happiness. From this material of principles, of which the chief is equality, we wish to reconstruct life, to divert those ancient springs which nourished former generations, to reconstitute our lives upon our newest plans, and to delineate these plans by the rules of science, while forced often to admit our ignorance of science itself. At every step, life reveals records of injustice instead of the justice with which we promised to enrich it, egoism, interest, and violence instead of love and peace, the sores of poverty and wretchedness instead of wealth and growing prosperity, tears and complaints instead of the joy which we foretold. Never mind, we repeat, each time louder and louder, to still the questionings, doubts, and objections. At least the principles of our century are preserved and upheld. Does it matter if generations of today suffer, if in place of the strong a weak people appears about us? Evil may reign today, tomorrow all will be well. A new generation will arise on the ruins of the old. Our principles will be justified in a new world by posterity in futurity. The dreams which fill our lives and inspire our labors will be realized some day. Alas, they will be realized as realized were the dreams of Swift. In youth he built an asylum for the mad. In old age he found a refuge there. How seldom do we find simplicity and directness in social intercourse? How seldom do we meet with men with whom conversation is a simple and natural interchange of thought? When we mix in society, we find ourselves daily brought into communication with men with whom we have nothing in common but humanity. We find no time to rest, none to observe, none to await in silence. If one should wish to act so, his partner would not allow it. Relationship
must at once be established, and etiquette demands that this relationship appear natural. Conversation must begin, and once begun upon the barren soil of trivialities, it becomes a mere exchange of phrases on subjects touching upon ordinary life. Men approach one another on the basis of triviality, in which all are liberal, and at later meetings the conversation thus begun seldom leaves the footing on which it was established first. Or it may be worse. At the first meeting men strike attitudes and pose to one another. This happens most often between persons of different positions, when one of the parties is in some way remarkable or distinguished, and the other wishes to place himself upon an equal social footing. For who does not imagine in himself some remarkable gift? Thus begins a duel between two insignificant personalities. Each strives to display his good qualities, to concede nothing, to awaken the interest and admiration of the other. To shine in conversation commonly implies intelligence, and who, nowadays, does not lay claim to intelligence, to wit, or to that knowledge of the world which often surpasses intelligence itself? What a vast field! What an infinite career of vanity and self-love! To this is joined the affectation of amiability. Every social virtue has its reverse of baseness, which is most openly revealed where the virtue assumes the aspect of propriety and is changed into social small coin of a similar stamp. What quantities of this coin have we not in circulation among us? How dulled has it become in passing thought! So many hands, and such hands! The noblest words have lost their primitive significance, in ceasing to be the expression of sincere thought. The deepest truths have become degraded by association with vulgar words. The most precious sentiments have become outworn and defiled by exhibition to all. The affectations of cleverness and amiability, these are the two great stimulants of conversation in society. We excuse the baseness of the first motive by the apparent respectability of the second. Conscience may convict us of folly, of pretense, of playing with words. We have an answer ready. I tried to be agreeable. I had to keep the conversation alive, to aid my host and hostess, and to prevent their guests being bored. But conscience judges justly, and amiability in no way covers or justifies baseness. Without the impulse of childish vanity, amiability alone will not induce one who respects himself and his words to play with phrases for hours, to assume, as necessity demands, the accents of love and indignation, to walk perpetually on stilts, to tell imaginary tales, and to give a free course of raillery and to sarcasm at the expense of a neighbor's weaknesses and faults. The 19th century justly boasts itself a century of reform, but these reformatory movements, beneficent in many of their operations, in others constitute the most terrible affliction of our time. The speed with which thoughts of analysis and reform circulate has often brought to our veins a fever, to allay which, with rest and diet, the time has long since arrived. But while the paroxysms of disturbed thought continue, one cannot think that reform can be healthy or fruitful. Life has marched so quickly that many ask with terror, whither do we go? Where shall we stop? If we shall fly upward, we shall not be able to breathe. If downward, then we shall fall into the pit. The idea of reform is passing through the same stages as every new and sound idea after it has attained popularity. At first it is the privilege of a few master spirits, burning with the fire of thought, of long experience, and of sincere feelings, who strive for its realization. Then, when the idea has become familiar, it becomes the property of the masses, It is accepted on faith, and at last circulates in the marketplace, and loses its sincerity and worth. In the moment of enthusiasm, the great apostles of the movement raise the standard, and while they bear it, this standard is the symbol of a great work, drawing servants to its ministry. But when it passes from the hands of the people, and little boys find pleasure in bearing it from place to place with meaningless cries, it loses its prestige, and serious persons turn away when they see it approach. There are periods when reform is the right fruit of social evolution, the expression of a necessity felt by all, when it loses the knots bound by immemorial social relations. Then the reformer appears a prophet who speaks with the voice of the public conscience, and realizes the thought which all bear in themselves. His words and his works master all because they bear witness to the truth, and all who are of the truth echo and emulate them. But when his work is done, sometimes arise after him legions of false prophets. All men, great and small, wish to be prophets, which bears a new word upon his lips, which has never been born in his soul, or ripened by experience, a catchword, cheap, and therefore feeble, stolen from the marketplace, and therefore base. He who has never done useful work, to whom idleness is the work of life, prepares projects for new legislation, or raises himself a little chair from which to preach reform, demanding that work which he has never done, and knows not how to do, be placed upon a new foundation. Such are the little. What shall they say of the great, who suffer equally from the fever of reform? The prevalent ailment from which our so-called statesmen suffer is ambition, or the thirst for renown. In our time, life flows with immeasurable speed. Statesmen succeed statesmen, each while in power burning with impatience for celebrity while there is yet time. He will not trouble to collect the threads laid down by his predecessor. He cannot waste his time with the little labors of organization, the amelioration of established institutions, or current affairs. Each must begin his work from the beginning, clear himself a field, make tabula rasa on which to create anew, for all men flatter themselves that they possess creative powers. What he shall create from, what are his materials? This question he seldom troubles to answer from a practical consideration of affairs. It is the act of creation which attracts him. He aspires to create from nothing, and his excited imagination answers all questions with the familiar phrases: "The institution will support itself. It will make its men. They will appear in due time." It is remarkable that the more infatuated the statesman is with his beliefs, the less he is prepared for his work by knowledge and experience. His desire for creation is the more seductive, as it requires no real knowledge, while it gives a wide field for the activity of the political charlatan, and makes celebrity attainable by the vulgarest means. Where active management, the knowledge of work, and the direction and improvement of existing institutions are required, it is easy to distinguish the man of knowledge and experience from the charlatan and dunce. But where undertakings are to be begun by criticism and condemnation of existing institutions, where institutions are to be organized anew on vaunted lines and principles, it is easy without immediate knowledge of affairs to contend in generalities, to show external perfection of construction, and to appeal to precedents existing, perhaps, beyond mountains and seas. On this field it is harder to distinguish the efficient from the inefficient, and the charlatan from the man of action. Here every great man, knowing little of affairs and troubling less to understand them, may easily justify any project of reform fabricated in subordinate offices by petty reformers themselves incited by the desire for cheap notoriety. This extraordinary phenomenon must be numbered among the characteristic elements of our political life. In different measures, it may be observed everywhere, in administrations, in privy councils, in committees. It is seen most plainly, of course, in those countries where institutions lack the sanction of historic precedent, where discipline has not been affirmed by centuries, where society, by its historic development, has brought out no defined classes or ramparts to guard against the gusts of thought and aspiration. The wider and freer the historic and economic field, the greater the room for the fantasies of reformers. In such circumstances, there is no conflict, and little need for reformers to measure themselves with affirmed ideas, interests, and parties. Then license reigns without control. While these appearances are seen on high, analogous action proceeds in the depths and abysses of the earth. In its nature, this movement also is reformatory, but it seeks a more radical reform. Masses of men dissatisfied with their condition, dissatisfied with social institutions, blinded by the wildest instincts of their nature, or infatuated by ideals born of the fantasies of narrow thought, rejecting all existing institutions sprung from the historic development of society, abjuring the church, the state, the family, the rights of property, aspire to the realization of their wild ideals on earth. These men demand that the reforms they extol shall begin at the beginning upon a clear field, which they desire first to disencumber of the ruins of all existing institutions. These are the enemies of civilization, cry the statesmen of Europe, and in the name of civilization arm themselves against the mass of improvised reformers. But the defenders of the existing order would do well to remember that they themselves have been the first to raise a daring hand against the existing things, to overthrow the ancient edifices, and to build others in their places, that often with reckless confidence they hasten to condemn that order, and to destroy the traditions and customs sprung from the genius and history of the people. By establishing new laws which ignore and cannot correspond with life, they have violated those same conditions of actuality which the enemies of civilization refuse to acknowledge. Victory over such enemies may be gained only in the name of these vital principles, and in the domain of sound reality. The word reform is so often repeated that we have begun to confound it with improvement. In the popular opinion, the apostles of reform are the apostles of improvement, or, as we say, progress, while on the other hand, those who question the need or utility of reform upon new principles are enemies of progress, enemies of advancement, enemies almost of good, of justice, and of civilization. In this opinion, so widely disseminated by our publicists, there is a great error and delusion. With such errors current, a common sense judgment on any subject finds it hard to make a path through prejudices, and concrete, actual, healthy thought must surrender to abstraction and fantasy. Men of action and knowledge are forced to give place to dreamers armed with abstract ideas enveloped in loud phrases. On the other hand, he enjoys credit from the first who poses as the representative of new ideas, the advocate of reform, who carries plans in his hands for the construction of new buildings. The political profession is crowded with architects, and all who would be workmen, landlords, or tenants must needs be architects first. It is plain that with such tendencies of thought and taste an infinite field is open for all manner of charlatanry, for all dexterity of the hypocrite, and the daring of ignorance, while practical work is hampered beyond measure when accomplished in the midst of disposition to analysis and criticism, and subjected to the test of the general principles and phrases which obtain currency in the world. He who ought to concentrate all his attention and all his strength upon his work, and upon devising means the better to fulfill it, must constantly take into account the opinions of others, and the impression it will produce on the world and on superiors, more especially if those superiors are infected with the new ideas.
Thus, on criticism and resistance to criticism, for the most part quite absurd, is wasted much force which might have accomplished great work. So much time goes in friction, in unfruitful struggle, that but little remains for real, concentrated labor. The worker is surrounded on all sides by illusory work, while the real and needed work slips from his hands and is left undone. Such a position is intolerable by good and earnest men. When concerned with life itself, with facts and living forces, they feel themselves strong. They trust in their work, and this trust gives them power to create wonders in the actual world. But they lose heart when they deal with images, symptoms, forms, and phrases. Then they have no faith. And without faith, all work is fruitless. Shall we wonder then that the best workers retire, or what is worse, and what more often happens, without leaving their posts, become indifferent to their duties, fulfilling them outwardly only for the sake of influence and emolument? Such are often the consequences of the fever for reform, when it extends too far. Where shall we find a physician to cure the evil? What hero will direct our strength to that actual amelioration which we so much need, for which in reality we thirst so much? Wait a little, we are told. The mysterious veil of reformation will be lifted, and a new and virgin life spring forth in the plenitude of beauty and strength. A new dawn will appear, revealing a country flowing with milk and honey. We have waited long, but the curtain has not been lifted. The new world has not appeared, but across the ancient veil another has been drawn. Meantime, it is enough to pass through the streets of cities, great or small, to see at every step the ameliorations we need. Everywhere round lie formless masses of abandoned work, forsaken institutions, and ruined temples. There are schools where the teachers have forsaken the pupils to compose papers on methods of instruction, or wordy discourses for public meetings. Colleges where, under the externals of education, nothing is learnt, and the bewildered teachers, in the confusion of orders and instructions, know not what to teach. There are hospitals where the afflicted fear to go because of the cold, the hunger, and the disorder caused by the indifference of interested managers. There are administrations with large funds at their disposal, where each official neglects all save his interests and ambitions. There are libraries where all is disordered or destroyed, where we cannot understand either the employment of the income or disposition of the books. There are streets which we cannot pass without terror or abhorrence, from uncleanliness poisoning the air, and from houses of drunkenness and disorder which encumber them. There are courts of justice dedicated to the greatest of all functions of government, through the incapacity of officials ruled by a chaos of disorder and injustice. There are departments from which the officials are absent, churches, a lamp unto the people, forsaken and closed, without service or song, or from which, through the irregularity of their services, the worshippers bring away nothing save confusion, ignorance, and irritation. Is there not here a harvest for which gleaners are needed, where all the forces of thought, of love, of indignation might well be directed, where we need not legislation to divert these forces, but the measures of masters and rulers, concentrating their efforts on a single spot for culture and improvement? There lies the real need of our time, which we sacrifice to abstract questions and sounding words. Do not trespass beyond the limits of thy destiny, was the advice of the ancient oracle. Do not undertake a charge beyond thy strength. How excellent the advice! All wisdom is in the construction of thought and power. All evil is in its dispersion. To work is not to dissipate our strength on a multitude of generalities and aspirations, but to choose a work and a field according to our measure, and to dig, and plant, and cultivate, to spend our living strength thereon, and to raise ourselves from work to knowledge, from knowledge to perfection. Wealth sets in motion a multitude of the basest impulses of human nature. It imposes on men great responsibilities and binds and restricts their freedom in many things. It becomes the object of exploitation, and is surrounded by a web of falsehoods of every kind. If the feelings of the rich were not benumbed, they would daily feel that their relations to men had changed, that many, even of their nearest friends, behaved no longer with simplicity, and that for a great number of the people with whom they dealt, their personalities did not exist, but had been replaced by their external figure, their capital. By men of sensibility, such a position is unbearable, and the rich man must possess great simplicity of heart to continue in pure and benevolent relations to the people around him, and to escape the demoralization and perversion which arise under the influence of his wealth. To a similar fate is subjected another great human force, intellect, more particularly intellect above the general level, and, above all, the intellect of the ruler. When an able man attains authority, when his name has become celebrated, all the basest impulses of human nature awaken around him. To approach him is an honor. He is no longer approached simply, but with the ulterior motive of appearing clever and awaking his attention. When the clever man is in fashion, there is no baseness too low to put on the mask of ability, and to display before him all the affectations of which baseness is capable. The consciousness of this falsehood and affectation would be intolerable, and would force him to avoid his kind if he were not himself the victim of similar weaknesses. Thus, too often we find clever men who, accustomed to the affectation of others, pose before their subordinates with all the absurdities of little minds, and find more pleasure in such society than the society of their equals. Few minds are free of this weakness. In one of her caustic letters to her husband, Mrs. Carlyle says, "Geraldine came yesterday afternoon. I fancy you find our talk amusing if you could assist at it in a cloak of darkness, for one of the penalties of being the wisest man and profoundest thinker of the age is the royal one of never hearing the plain, unornamented truth spoken. Everyone striving to be wise and profound, in vita natura, in the presence of such a one, and making himself as much as possible into his likeness. And this is the reason that Arthur Helps and so many others talk very nicely to me and bore you to distraction. With me they are not afraid to stand on the little, broad basis of their own individuality, such as it is. With you they are always balancing themselves, like Taglioni, on the point of their moral or intellectual great toe." Letters and Memorials from Jane Welsh Carlyle. In the dark ages of history, a condition of society existed in which over all citizens hung a feeling of suspicion and distrust. Contemporary writers speak with terror of cities where men feared to look into each other's eyes, to speak to their neighbors, even to the members of their own households, a frank word devoid of artifice, or to give rein to the simplest impulses of their minds, for fear of malevolent interpretation which might lead to the persecution in the name of the state or in the interest of public safety. From the dark corners of the lowest strata of society appeared a body of prosperous professional informers, actually formed into corporations, a mysterious power before which all prostrated themselves in silent terror, or, when silence could not be, expressed their thoughts in false, flattering, and hypocritical words. When we read such accounts of the times of Duke Biron in Russia, and of the Terror in France, we rejoice that we live in another age, and that the events of those days are but traditions for us. Yet, if we examine more closely the appearances around us, we shall have to admit that symptoms of similar conditions are not unknown. We might indeed go further, and say that mutual suspicion has driven its roots deeper into our inner life than even in those ages. What strikes us most in recent years is the absence of that simplicity and sincerity in our relations which constitute the chief interest of social life, inspire it with the breath of freshness, and serve as a symptom of healthiness. How seldom do we find simplicity in the conduct of men! How delightful would it be to approach men simply,
without those artifices and ulterior motives which bring forth dark shadows, confounding our relations to our fellow creatures. Of such shadows an innumerable multitude has formed in these latter times, resembling a host of evil spirits, sowing discord in the air. Whence have they come? Did they reflect defined ideas? We might oppose them with similar ideas. But no, for the most part, they are engendered by impressions unconsciously inspired with the air we breathe, as atoms of infected matter in the time of pestilence. The air today is tainted with the germs of moral and intellectual epidemics of every kind. Their name is legion, and other name it would be hard to find. Observe how men, strangers or friends, behave in society upon business or pleasure. Hardly have they met, hardly have they exchanged a greeting, when shadows arise between them. With the first word uttered by one, through the mind of the other, a reservation has passed. Ah, these are his opinions. This is his school. These are his convictions, the favorite of modern terms, and one of the most deceptive. This man is a liberal, a clerical, a reactionary, a socialist, an anarchist, a free trader, a protectionist, a disciple of the Moskovsky Vedomosti, a supporter of Nidel, of the Vestnik Yevropoi, and so on. Observe how, after this first impression, mutual distrust burns more and more fiercely, degenerating at last to irritation, till all rational exchange of thought becomes impossible. Then sharp and caustic phrases relieve intermittently in constrained silence, till at last the new acquaintances part in total ignorance of one another, yet with mutual condemnation. Each at once classified the other in a certain category with which he had before decided he had nothing in common. Whence does this absurd irritation spring? From convictions? In the majority of cases, neither one nor the other has any reasoned convictions, or belongs to any recognized party. He has repeated something read in the newspapers a day before, or taken from the conversation of a friend, who himself seeks his opinions at an equally childish source. How much great strength is lost or sterilized by this childish play with impressions and symptoms of conviction! Men, in reality honest, virtuous, and capable, instead of working as hard as may be at the practical, actual work to which they are called, cross their arms, waste their energy, exhaust themselves in fruitless irritation and anger, because work on certain principles, with certain theories and certain views, is impossible. They have scarcely put their hands to their work before it has repelled them. They lose faith in it because it does not correspond with their conceptions of usefulness. Everywhere we see the same absurd failing. Masters, from fanatic attachment to principles, systems, and methods of education, neglect their schools, where the unhappy pupils are sacrificed to stupid or idle teachers. Yet each of these teachers, in turn, is ready at a moment's notice to argue on the abstract principles of a work which he cannot do and does not understand. Our courts cry out for lawyers of experience, devoted to their profession for love of it, our universities for jurisprudents who love their work as the work of their lives, but our jurists, professors, and practitioners alike have hardly met when, through mutual suspicion, they seek to tear each other asunder as reactionaries, clericals, or radicals, or over ideas of punishment, of trial by jury, of civil marriage, or the administration of prisons on one system or another. Go to the meetings of the innumerable commissions for consideration of new projects. Observe the wild disorder. Listen to the interruptions of members from the various departments across the green table. See the glances they cast at one another. What distrust, what suspicion, what affectation in the delivery of speeches, what turgid and empty phrases! Where does it spring? From the task appointed, which is seldom performed? No, from some petty idea which the speaker has picked up elsewhere, and which he brings and with himself, rather on which he brings himself ad astra, or from some theory, on rare occasions taken carefully from a good book. In our salons, hardly has a conversation passed from banal phrases and the latest news when the same phenomenon is reproduced. A confusion of tongues with like confusion of ideas is heard, an inconsistency of thought from which we shrink with amazement and repulsion. Often we meet men whose speeches and actions protest against their names, their callings, the work which they outwardly perform and by which they live. The heads of schools contemptuously refer to pedagogues who insist upon rigorous discipline. The soldier condemns the old-fashioned persons who maintain the necessity of military discipline. The priest condemns the practice of attending Mass on festival days. Judges and jurists discuss the ignorance of those who require the punishment of thieves or the obedience of servants to their masters. All fly asunder over theories. Few can unite for action, because from their first steps they differ in their conceptions of work, or rather in those obscure phrases with which they express their conceptions. Whence does all this proceed? We must seek the cause in the monstrous, immeasurable development of vanity in all and each. This is the same petty self-love as inspires a youth, ignorant of the world of men, on entering the society of strangers, to assume an inimical tone, to lose his self-possession, to affect bitterness, irony, and arrogance. He bears to this unknown exchange his own capital, a high opinion of himself, and the knowledge that others value him below his own estimate irritates him, deprives him of his simplicity, sets him, as it were, perpetually on his tiptoes, and gives him an air of meaningless protest against his surroundings. Conceive a company wholly formed of persons as sickly, as immeasurably vain as he. Taken by itself, such a group would be ludicrous enough, yet, absurd as it appears, it serves as a true image of assemblies of persons met by accident, or for the purpose of some common action. There are many terms which have been outworn to worthlessness through constant employment by everyone without precise application, terms by use of which the fool in his own mind is made wise, and the most ignorant exalted to the height of knowledge. Current words may be vulgarized to such an extent that serious men have scruples in employing them. They feel that these terms, bandied everywhere, have taken permanently the associations of baseness and triviality inseparable from vulgar use. The time has then come for such words to be laid awhile in the lumber room of thought. They must rest awhile and be purified in the crucible, before they may again appear in the world as precise and comprehensible expressions. With such a fate is threatened that favorite word, evolve or evolution. In books, in pamphlets, in leading articles and feuilletons, in intercourse at table, in sermons at church, in the conversation of salons, in official documents, in lectures, in the lessons of gymnasia and elementary schools, everywhere flies the sound of this magic word, till we feel wearied when it is pronounced. It is indeed time to test the idea which this word expresses. It is time to reflect that this term evolution, in disunion from its complementary term involution, has no definite meaning at all. It is time to turn to our common mother and teacher, nature, for the explanation of the idea. By her we are taught that all development proceeds from a center, and without a center is inconceivable, that no plant can arise from the soil, that no flower can bear fruit in the center of creative force, of development and production of sap, is withered. Unhappily, we have forgotten nature, and so, without regarding her, we construct our childish schemes of development. With rude hand we would open the bud mechanically, before the time has come for its opening by the internal action of natural forces. We rejoice and call this evolution. We destroy the bud, and its open petals wither, without a healthy blossom, or hope of healthy fruit. Is not this madness? Is it not like the folly of the child in the fable who strove to dry up the sea with a spoon? How many of such foolish children have we in our self-appointed developers and teachers? In them the passion of evolution becomes fanaticism, and there is no blockhead or dunce who does not consider himself capable of evolving something. Yet, were these the sole victims of the infatuation, it would be well. What is most remarkable is that, besides them, and sometimes behind them, stand men of apparent ability, serious thinkers, enchanted by the magic word, bought with the current money of the marketplace, who repeat it, affirm it, and on this shibboleth and the vague conceptions it expresses, organize whole systems of educational training. And all these fantasies arise, all these plans are composed for the purpose of operating in anima vili on the mass of the so-called uncultivated classes, on the body of the people. A campaign is planned, but there is neither leaders nor soldiers. No one will trouble to mingle with the masses, to live their lives, to examine their psychic nature, their soul, for the masses have a soul, with which those who would understand them must enter into communion. No, our reformers and educators see in them only a certain mass, an aggregation of intellectual forces on which to try their experiments. And what astonishing audacity! They demand in the name of some supreme and absolute aim that submission to these experiments be obligatory and by force. How they are to be conducted, on this our teachers are at variance, but there are as many systems and methods as there are heads. In one thing only they all agree, in a determination to act on the thought and develop it. In vain our weak voices protest that the simple man is not mind alone, but soul also, that, like all other men, he has in his heart a base on which he builds his whole life, by which the edifice of the church is supported. No, our educators will address themselves to the mind alone, and strive to incite in it an idle activity on those questions which the enlighteners have themselves so cheaply and cheerfully solved. What a ludicrous error! If, abandoning their baseless assurance, their exaggerated conception of their own intelligence, these men were to descend to the dark masses beneath, and enter in communion with them, they would find that while those who live in darkness seek and cry for light, and thirst for enlightenment, yet they will let it enter only from that side from which they feel that it will truly enlighten them, leaving their souls untroubled and their lives undestroyed. They feel that of all things dear to them, their spiritual nature is the dearest, and through their hearts alone will they let in the light. When the light of reason dawns from this side, it does not blind them or ruin their lives, or disturb the equilibrium of existence. But when the operations of development are directed exclusively to the mind, when they are begun with the imparting of generalities and the so-called knowledge of textbooks, our educators act as men who would stand a cone upon its apex. All life is movement. Never, it seems, has movement been so swift as in our time. But this movement is intermittent, feverish, sickly, not a natural succession, but an involuntary course of sensations, not a constant aspiration to a single aim, but a sequence of diverse desires affected by every wind. Can this be life? We ask ourselves as we watch a crowd devouring and devoured by life, in thought and anxiety forever. The highest gift of God and of nature, said Goethe, is life, the revolution of the monad about itself, a movement which knows no stoppage or repose, while to each is given a congenital impulse which incites him to sustain and develop it, although its nature remains a mystery for all men living. To live, what a simple matter it seems. Quel est mon mystère? Asked Montaigne, and answered himself, Mon mystère c'est vivre. But how complex are the lives created by men, above all by men of modern times, which each day they meditate more deeply upon life, its purpose and its aim, concentrating upon one object all their thoughts. Life without thought would be the life of animals, but thought should be a living thing, turned to the practical purpose of life. Yet in our day, men live for thought and life. The simple and precious gift of God is swallowed up by it. Life is the free movement of all the powers and impulses of human nature, and this movement itself is its end, and therefore, to state the aim of life as a movement of intellect only, of heart only, of passion only, is to restrict and deform it. Life has been artificially deformed by these thoughts upon itself. Goethe, in his time, cried with disgust, "Poor men, to whom the head is everything. Armer Mensch, an dem der Kopf alles ist." Do we live, he continues? Have we worked ourselves out of life by its analysis, and must attempt to enter it again? Goethe's words were inspired by thought of the professors, the scholars, and the young students of his time. Since his time, how much farther has this analysis gone, and how much of life has been devoured by it? In Goethe's time, in the latter half of the 18th century, thinkers were struck by the growing discord between thought and life, by the prevalence of that of weariness of life, Weltschmerz, then in fashion among the younger generation. This complaint is no longer common, but its place has been taken by the theory of pessimism, a new conception of life, which rules men's minds with a hopeless and intolerable dominion. This is no simple disillusion sprung from the contradiction between actuality and the highest ideals of the soul. It is a set negation of the world in which we move, not a simple weariness of life awakened by a struggle with the ills of humanity, but a wicked, hopeless, and destroying denial which admits of but one issue from the gulf of despair, to pluck from the soul itself the very desire to live. To this extent have we perverted life. We trust that thought alone would serve for the direction of life, for the better ordering of its movements. We believed that it would help us to live, yet we find that life has been annihilated by thought, till neither life nor thought remains. Such is the fashionable theory of life, greedily seized by the readers of its illustrious apostle, a theory which has made life more elusive enough before, for the partisans and supporters of this theory continue to satisfy freely all their animal impulses, in themselves proving the contradiction between life and their artificial theory of life, a theory in which there is no room for faith or justice or energy of will striving to embody itself in activity. What then remains? There remains a negation of life stolen from books without experience of life, a sterile scheme of truth taken from books also, a dead effigy of nature in the dress of a chemical formula, and a feeble will inclined to renunciation of a life which from the material point of view has been a failure.